Good evening. Again, it's a pleasure to be here this week, and I'm so thankful for, again, Byron and the Smiths keeping me in their home. We've had a lot of good times together, good conversations, and meeting with many of you in your homes. So thank you for the good meals and the times together and the good fellowship. Tonight our lesson will be building on everything that we've talked about so far. And I've entitled it Darwin's Achilles Heel, the Lack of Transitional Fossils, Dinosaur Fossil Fleshy Tissue, and the Death of Neo-Darwinism. And as we've been saying since the beginning, our faith lies in the Scripture. In the Scripture in Genesis 1, in verse 1, we see it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then we know from Exodus 31:17, it says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh he rested. And we'll be dealing with that a lot more on Friday. But many people don't believe this, sometimes even Christians, that God really made the world in 6 days. And we have to be aware, as we've said since the beginning, that there will be godless worldviews and error taught. Notice what Paul says in 1 Timothy 6:20 to Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings, and oppositions of science, that's what the King James Version says, which is another word for knowledge, falsely so called. In Colossians 2:8, Paul said, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than to Christ. So we need to guard against this. And of course in Acts, we remember when Paul in chapter 13 went to the island of Cyprus to preach. He was preaching to the Roman proconsul or governor Sergius Paulus, and he was opposed by this Jewish false magician, Bar Jesus, also known as Elymas. And Paul said, it says, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked intently at him and said, O full of all deceit and all fraud, you son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, will you not cease perverting the straight ways of the Lord? So we shouldn't be surprised. We should expect this. We should just be able to defend the faith, and as we said a couple nights ago, in a gentle and humble and godly demeanor. Nevertheless, we should defend the faith. 1 Peter 3:15 says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. So that's what we're hoping to do this week, to fill you with some knowledge regarding things in the world, regarding intelligent design, and in the Scripture, to show those in the world that there are answers. And you may not, as when I talked to some people last night, you may not remember everything that's taught here. Maybe you'll remember a few principles, but the main thing to remember is that there are answers to many of these godless arguments. So, there's really 3 parts of this lesson. We're going to cover 3 parts. I call it Darwin's Achilles heel. These are 3 strong arguments you can use when talking to people. First of all is the lack of transitional fossils. That is the lack of what we often call intermediate links or missing links because they're simply not there. Number 2, dinosaur fossil fleshy tissue, bone proteins, DNA in fossils that are supposedly 60 or 100 million years old. And finally, we'll talk about the death of Neo-Darwinism. But first, geology does not reveal transitional fossils. So Darwin said everything evolved from a single-celled organism to us today. So there must be many transitional fossils showing these links. But I want to give you 3 quotes to show that this is the only way evolution can actually be proven. Austin Clarke said that evolution actually did occur can only be scientifically established by the discovery of the fossilized remains of representative samples of those intermediate types. So you have to find the missing links. Number 2, fossils, Dr. Carl Dunbar said, provide the only historical documentary evidence then life has evolved from simpler to more and more complex forms. And finally, Dr. Pierre-Paul Grosset, he was the past president of the French Academy of Sciences, said naturalists must remember that the process of evolution is revealed only through fossil forms. Now, did Charles Darwin know this? Yes, and he said it was a big problem for him. In The Origin of Species, he said, why is not every geological formation, every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology does not reveal this organic chain, and this is perhaps the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. But when you look in the fossils, you don't see these links. Even Dr. Mark Ridley admitted this. He said, in any case, no real evolutionist, whether gradualist or punctuationist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. Well, that stands in contrast to the second quote that said fossils provide the only historical evidence. Notice Dr. Gareth Nilsson from the American Museum of Natural History said the idea that one can go to the fossil record and expect to empirically recover an ancestor-descendant sequence has been and continues to be a pernicious lie. So as Darwin said, life should have evolved in this tree of life with a single-celled organism at the bottom, and you should have all the connecting fossils going to the top. But as we showed, when you look at the fossil record, we pointed out on Monday night, we see the opposite. The lightest part is at the bottom, the greatest diversity. And since then, we've been losing 30,000 species of animals a year. So we're having less and less. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould pointed this out in his book, Wonderful Life. And in this book, he shows Darwin's tree of life, but he says you have to turn it upside down in a way, because the greatest diversity was on the bottom, and we have less and less. So animals aren't evolving into other animals. We don't see more and more. Notice what Charles Darwin said here, or excuse me, Stephen Jay Gould. He said the absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. He goes on to say the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. In other words, if the public knew that there weren't these transitions, it would destroy our trade. And then he said most species do not exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. A species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. Now, he had a counterpart in the 1980s especially that began teaching this, and that was Dr. Niles Eldridge from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. He was also a professor at Columbia University. And he said if ever there was a myth, it is that evolution is a process of constant change. And he came to this based on his study of the trilobite. So some of the children may remember these from their books. The trilobite, this ancient animal that became extinct. They're kind of like little roly-poly creatures that lived in the shallow sea floors. So he studied these. They supposedly lived between 540 and 250 million years ago. So they lived, they say, for a period of 290 million years. So his goal was to study their eyes and see how did their eyes evolve over these 290 million years. Do you know what he found? They were exactly the same at the beginning and the end. There was no evolution. And so he and Stephen Jay Gould had to come up with an idea. How do we explain this? If there's no transitional fossils, they came up with an idea called punctuated equilibrium. I have a whole lecture on this. I just put this as point one here. But punctuated equilibrium is the idea that everything stays in equilibrium. There's no evolution for millions of years. And then all of a sudden, something evolves very quickly, so quickly that it doesn't leave the fossils in the fossil record. So this is one of the only times in history that a major scientific theory or hypothesis is based on a complete lack of evidence. The fact that there is no evidence there is supposed to be proof that the animals evolved. And finally, on the first point, They both said, they wrote in this article and said, punctuated equilibrium, or PE, has been accepted by most of our colleagues as a valuable addition to evolutionary theory. Paleontologists never wrote papers on the absence of change in lineages. In other words, they didn't admit there were missing links before punctuated equilibrium granted the subject some theoretical space. So point number one summary, there are no transitional fossils between major biological phyla, therefore macroevolution did not occur. Point number two, let's look at fleshy tissue, proteins, and DNA in dinosaur fossils. They're supposedly hundreds of millions of years old. So again, where do dinosaurs fit into the Bible? You recall this from Sunday night. What does the Bible teach? All land creatures were made on the sixth day of creation in Genesis 1:24. Dinosaur fossils, in fact, were not discovered until 1822 by Dr. Gideon Mantell. The word dinosaur was not even invented until 1841 by Sir Richard Owen. And I suggested that dinosaurs were previously known by the name dragon. That's why there are hundreds of dragon legends around the world. Let me give you a little more evidence before we look at the fleshy tissue. The Stegosaurus, most children are familiar with the Stegosaurus dinosaur. It was not discovered until 1876, the fossils. We didn't even know what it looked like. But somehow, 700 years before that, the Cambodians in 1186 AD knew what the stegosaur looked like. This is a temple deep in the jungles of Cambodia, a Buddhist temple. Don Patton took this picture. He traveled there. And along the column of this temple, there are a number of different animals. If you zoom in on this one here, you'll see that it's a stegosaurus, clearly. How did the Cambodians know what the stegosaurus looked like 700 years before the fossils were ever discovered? This is an ancient Inca carving on a stone approximately from 100 AD. So this is 1900 years ago. Now notice that it has the sauropod carving on there and it has the frills on its neck. Well, the problem is that sauropod frills were not discovered until 1992. So how do they know what they look like 1900 years before that? And as we also said on Sunday night, dinosaurs have been one of the most powerful recruiting tools for evolution. But what do they prove, really? What do dinosaurs prove? Number one, they prove that large reptiles once lived on the earth and became extinct. Yes, they were large. Here is supposedly the largest dinosaur that ever lived, Dreadnoughtus shreni. It was 65 tons compared to a 5-ton elephant. Well, we have large animals today. In fact, the blue whale, 200 tons, it would take 3 D shrenis to equate to one blue whale. So yes, there were large reptiles on Earth, but we have large reptiles today. We have some reptiles that are 20 feet long and 2,000 pounds. They're called the crocodiles. But what does that prove about evolution? Nothing. Another line of evidence I want to show you are the limestone chalk beds. So these chalk beds are found all around the world. These chalk beds are composed of a protozoal organism, their exoskeleton, made of calcium carbonate, called foraminifera. You may know it as diatoms or diatomaceous earth. So trillions of these little creatures left their exoskeletons. In fact, most of you probably are familiar with it and used it tonight. How many people brush their teeth? I did. You used their skeletons. That's what's in your toothpaste. Diatoms. Now, supposedly, these were formed at the bottom of the ocean over millions and millions of years. And evolutionists say it takes about 1,000 years to develop 1 to 6 millimeters of this on the bottom of the ocean. And so they say it took about 100 million years to build these chalk beds in Dorset, Ireland. We see these chalk beds all around the world. Here are the White Cliffs of Dover. Those are chalk beds made up of diatoms. There, sky view. The chalk bluffs of Texas. In Demopolis, Alabama, the chalk bluffs there. The Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee. In Normandy, France. Off the Mediterranean coast in northern Israel. But the interesting thing is, buried in this chalk bed, supposedly developed at the bottom of the ocean, are dinosaur fossils. In the Smoky Hill chalk in Kansas, they found a number of dinosaur fossils. One of these was a Claosaurus, 15 feet tall and over 1,000 pounds, buried in this chalk. Number one, what was the dinosaur doing in the middle of the ocean? Well, they say, oh, it must have gotten washed out there. Number two, if it took millions of years for these beds to, the sediment to be laid down, why didn't these bones decompose? Other fossils have been found. A Neo-Darwinism, 16.5 feet long and 1,300 pounds has been found, as well as this one, a very big one, Ankylosaurus, 30 feet long and up to 10,000 pounds. Now, how did it get buried in the ocean? If it, laying on its side, if it's approximately 6 feet high, and if it takes 1,000 years to develop, let's just conservatively say 6 millimeters, it would take 305,000 years to cover this dinosaur. And we're expected to believe in 300,000 years, these bones didn't decompose. Do you know what I would suggest, and most creation scientists? That this is all a result of a great cataclysmic process in the flood, when the water swept up these diatoms, this diatomaceous sediment, and in a self-sorting procedure, they showed this in experimental water tanks, that different sized sediments sort together. So all these diatoms would sort together and be laid down together. Furthermore, they have found animal tracks in this diatomaceous earth. This is the Chalk Canyon Formation in Arizona, where they found carnivore tracks and terrestrial plant fossils that didn't decompose. Well, what were animals doing walking out in the middle of the ocean on the seafloor bed? Well, they weren't. This is based during the Great Flood, when the waters would wash up, they would recede, the animals would be retreating and walk over the surface. In fact, this was found many years ago. This is in the 1960s. They found 20 dinosaur tracks on the calcite dolomite beds just west of Jerusalem. What were dinosaurs doing walking on the bottom of the seafloor? Well, this wasn't the bottom of the seafloor. Again, this is where the water washed up, receded, the animals walked across, and then it was infilled with other sediment. And based on the size of these tracks, they think it may have been, it was a 5-foot 2-inch stride, it may have been a 6-foot pteropod, possibly a Herrerasaurus. So this is just all evidence to show that the evolutionary timeline and sedimentary buildup is incorrect. Well, what do dinosaur bones prove? Number two, there are massive burials that indicate that many of these dinosaurs died in a large flood, such as the pictures you see here. In fact, one example is in Zhujiang, China, in the Shandong province, where they found 15,000 dinosaur bones that were discovered in one 980-foot-long ravine. And this is what happened. They were excavating one of their superhighways over there. And during the process, they started uncovering dinosaur bones. They reported it to the authorities. They had to stop construction for some period of months and let the paleontologists come in and excavate all these dinosaur bones. And I'm going to show you the picture of over 15,000 bones that were discovered. I think all these indicate that these dinosaurs were washed together in the great global flood. And that's why we see them in such large burial pits. They even discovered a new dinosaur, Sinoceratops zhuchingus. Now, it's not only in China, there's other places in the world. In fact, here in the U.S., Dinosaur National Monument, they found thousands of dinosaurs washed together there. Is that how dinosaurs lived and died? No, this had to be a great catastrophic, cataclysmic process. So next, if dinosaurs allegedly lived from 65 to 245 million years ago, why do we still find intact fleshy dinosaur tissues, proteins, DNA, bone proteins, hemoglobin, and red blood cells? The answer is, if these animals were buried in Noah's great flood, then they're less than 4,400 years old, and not up to 245 million years old. Because of course, these organic fleshy tissues could not survive for millions of years without either decomposing or petrifying. Now, there's a well-known scientist that discovered a number of these and published on these. Her name was Dr. Mary Schweitzer. She published on this in the 1990s and early 2000s. Dr. Schweitzer started discovering a lot of these fleshy tissues, and she was opposed. They tried to prevent her from getting her PhD. She was here in North Carolina, actually. They tried to prevent her from getting her papers published because they didn't want this information getting out there. Now, note, she's not a creationist. She was just trying to report what she found. She believed in evolution. She believed in the millions of years. But this is what she said. When you think about it, the laws of chemistry and biology and everything else that we know say that it should be gone. It should be degraded completely. Well, certainly. In 65 million years, you think there's still going to be blood cells and DNA left? Well, I'll give you some examples. And for each of these examples, I'm giving the scientific paper and the URL that it can be found in case there's any question. First of all, from 1992, it was published, they found bone protein. It wasn't decomposed. In a seismosaur bone, supposedly 150 million years old. Next, hadrosaur blood vessels and protein sequences that were supposedly 80 million years old. They actually sequenced the proteins and found the amino acid sequence. Next, in 1994, they discovered dinosaur DNA from hadrosaur bones, supposedly 65 million years old. They found collagen in T-Rex and a hadrosaur bone, supposedly 68 million years old. This is one of Dr. Schweitzer's paper here. She found collagen. In 2007, she published it in supposedly 68 million year T-Rex bone. We're all concerned about our skin, and of course collagen makes up the skin. Well, how would you like collagen and skin that lasted for 68 million years? Who can believe it? They found hemoglobin fragments. What's hemoglobin? That is the iron-binding compound that's in your blood. That it's made of iron and it binds oxygen. They found this in T-Rex bone, supposedly 67 million years old. This was another of Dr. Schweitzer's publications. They found ichthyosaur skin, actual skin, that was supposedly 19 million years old. In fact, the next slide is the actual micrograph. This is looking at the skin under a microscope, supposedly 19 million years old. Psittacosaurus skin is supposedly even older, 125 million year old skin. You can see the micrograph on the microscope there. Mosasaur, they found blood as well as retina that was not decomposed. It was up to 68 million years old. From a mosasaur, estimated to be 70 million years old, they did carbon-14 dating, and it only came back to around 24,000 years old. Now, in this next publication from 2005, Dr. Schweitzer found a lot of fleshy tissue from T-Rex that's supposedly 68 million years old. And she put some actual photos in her publication. You're looking now at actual tissue from a T-Rex that's supposedly 68 million years old. Who can believe it? Now you know why they didn't want her to publish it. And notice the picture in the upper left, the upper inset here, and this is what it says in the caption. The demineralized fragment is flexible, and it's looking at this piece here, this tan piece. It's flexible and resilient, and when stretched, it returns to its original shape. It's still stretchy. After 68 million years? I don't think so. Finally, on this second point, how did the dinosaurs become extinct? I just throw this in because a lot of people ask this. Well, the fact is there have been over 100 different theories or hypotheses on how they became extinct. We have no clue. Even Dr. Michael Benton said many hundreds of pages have been written about how the dinosaurs became extinct without our being any the wiser. Of course, the public schools, they're going to teach you the asteroid theory, that dust covered the earth, blocked out the sun, and killed the dinosaurs. They really have no idea. So point number 2, summary, fleshy tissue and DNA in dinosaur fossils disproves macroevolution. And the last point tonight, point 3, is the death of Neo-Darwinism and the search for a new evolutionary mechanism. And this is often, when I talk to someone, this is where I go first. This is my first and I believe strongest point. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at Darwinism, Neo-Darwinism, and how they're looking for a new idea, and they're all dead so far. First of all, let's refresh your memory. What is evolution? Well, as it's taught in school, Neo-Darwinism is all animals evolved from a mechanism that involved 2 processes. Number 1, mutations in the DNA. And number 2, the mutant species were able to outcompete the wild type, leave more offspring, and thus they evolved into higher life forms. But did you know that Neo-Darwinism that is taught in school based on these 2 principles, it's been dead for at least 70 years, and yet they still teach it in schools. And we'll document from the evolutionists why it's been dead. Well, why do they still teach it in schools? I think from the Bible, this is just my reasoning and my understanding of God's Word, for at least 2 reasons. Number 1, simply dishonesty. Jesus talked about this in John 3:19, and he said, "And this is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil." Some people just want to oppose truth. Number 2, for fear of the majority. For fear of society, peers, teachers, colleagues, employers, ridicule. Notice what Jesus said in John 12:42. Nevertheless, even among the rulers, and often we say the Jews, the Jewish rulers, they opposed Jesus and they didn't believe him. Actually, Jesus said that the rulers did believe him. Many believed him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. So let's back up to Charles Darwin. Before we get to Neo-Darwinism, let's cover Darwinism. What is Darwinism? Well, of course, Charles Darwin wrote his first book, as we mentioned this week, in 1859, on the origin of species. And he proposed this idea of natural selection, survival of the fittest, and the fittest animals can leave more offspring and evolve. But he had no mechanism for how this occurred. How did they pass on these characteristics? How did they pass on these developed features to their offspring? He didn't have an idea in 1859, but 9 years later, he came up with an idea, and he called it pangenesis. Pangenesis. This is Darwinism. It's been dead since 1895. But what was his idea? What was this pangenesis? So it's to us today, it seems a crazy idea, mainly because we know about genes and genetics. But you have to realize Darwin didn't know about this, so he was just making up an idea. So he said, based on pangenesis, that animals would be able to adjust to their environment, and then they would be able to, let's say their organs were affected, or their skin, or their ligaments, their tendons, their muscles, their bones. And those are called the somatic cells in the body. So when the somatic cells were affected, it would send what he called gemmules. The gemmules would then be sent to what we know as the germ cells, or the reproductive cells in the male and female. So the body would be affected in the somatic cells. It would send gemmules to the reproductive cells, and that would affect the offspring. And a very crude example would be that if parents build strong muscles, they would pass those gemmules down to their children. And this is just a crude comical example. Children will be born with strong muscles. Okay, that seems ridiculous, doesn't it? But here's a real example that he proposed. So he, as well as Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in France, proposed that the giraffe, the way it got its long neck, is the giraffe started out as like a little spotted horse. But in the African plains and savannas, it would have to stretch and reach up to get the high leaves in the branches. And over time, when it stretched up, the gemmules in its neck would be passed down to its reproductive cells. And each generation, the giraffe would get a little bit taller. That was the idea of Darwinism. Well, there was a scientist named August Weismann who about 30 years later didn't believe this. German scientist, very prominent scientist, and he set out to either prove or disprove pangenesis, gemmules, and Darwinism. And what he did is he got 68 mice, and he chopped off the tails of 68 mice. And then he bred them over 5 generations. So took the 68 mice, bred them, chopped off the tails of all their offspring. Bred them again over 5 generations. What happened when he got to the last mouse? The 901st mouse, it still had a tail on it. In other words, it doesn't matter how you affect the body. It's not going to be passed on to the offspring. So by 1895, pangenesis and Darwinism was dead. But here's the key. From 1895 until 1942, they knew Darwinism was dead, so did they quit teaching it in school? No. They kept teaching it. In fact, this was right in the middle of time when they had the Scopes monkey trial not too far from here in Tennessee. And they continued to teach Darwinism until Neo-Darwinism was established, which was really called the modern synthesis in 1942. And this is where Neo-Darwinism came from. So Darwinism's dead. Where did Neo-Darwinism come from? Well, we mentioned last night or 2 nights ago this man, Gregor Mendel. So he's the father of genetics. He was a creationist, a believer in God, in Jesus, opposed Darwinian evolution, and he, unlike Darwin, actually conducted experiments. His experiments were very extensive by anyone's standards. He tested 29,000 pea plants. And from 29,000 pea plants, he showed the inheritance of various traits. That in some peas you could have yellow or green. You could have wrinkled or smooth. You could have flat, constricted, or full, short or tall, purple or white blossoms. And he taught how, based on the genes, these could be passed down. And you could select for these. Well, his work was all but forgotten for about 30 years. He published this in 1866, and many historians believe, because everyone was enthralled with Darwinism, that they totally ignored his work, and modern genetics and science was held back for 30 years. Some even believe that, some argue, I've heard, that he sent his paper to Darwin, but Darwin couldn't understand or appreciate the mathematics very much, and so he didn't respond to it or discarded it. Well, by around 1900, in the 1890s, Hugo de Vries rediscovered Gregor Mendel's work and rediscovered and made popular gene theory. Well, you know what happened then? The Darwinists were looking for a replacement for Darwinism, so they stole the creationist idea of genetics and combined it with natural selection. And that's where we stand today. They robbed us, they robbed the creationists of gene theory and applied it to the humanistic idea of Neo-Darwinism. So this is when Neo-Darwinism was developed. The main 7 architects that developed this between 1936 and 1947 are pictured here. We've quoted from Theodosius Dobzhansky a number of times. And in 1942, Dr. Julian Huxley, you'll see him. If you want to study the history, very interesting. He and his grandfather were atheists. His grandfather was contemporary with Charles Darwin. His name was Sir Thomas Huxley. He was known as Darwin's bulldog. And he was the one that told Darwin not to use the Neanderthal man because he didn't believe that it was our ancestor. Anyway, by 1942, little Julian Huxley then had grown up, and he was a prominent evolutionist, and he called this the modern synthesis of evolution. That's what it's still called today, Neo-Darwinism, and it's still taught in schools today and will be taught tomorrow. And again, the modern synthesis is based on random mutations, genetics, and natural selection or survival of the fittest. However, here is the problem. Famous unbelievers and scientists have admitted, at least since the 1950s, that random mutations and natural selection cannot account for macroevolution. Here are some famous modern scientists. All of these are evolutionists. Many of these are atheists. But all say Neo-Darwinism that is taught in public schools cannot create macroevolution. There are professors from Rutgers, University of Massachusetts Amherst, University of Lund, Chicago University, American Museum of Natural History, Colorado State, Swarthmore, the Smithsonian Institute, Stanford. There are numerous scientists all around the country. That brings us to 1809. In 1809, it was the 200th anniversary of Charles Darwin's birth. And so they wanted to have this private conference in Altenburg, Austria. The purpose of the conference was to come up with a new mechanism to replace Neo-Darwinism. So they said, we know it's still taught in schools, even though it's not true. We need to come up with a new idea. And this became known as the Altenburg 16. The 16 scientists that gathered in Altenburg, Austria. It was supposed to be a private conference, but this reporter, I think she's Australian, Susan Mazur, she may be from Western Europe. She wrote this book, an expose of the evolution industry, the Altenburg 16. And she interviewed people that went to this conference and some people that weren't invited. Here are the members of the Altenburg 16, some of the most well-known evolutionists in the world that all deny what's being taught in public schools is true. We have professors from University of Vancouver, Limburg, Tennessee, Tel Aviv, Chicago, Oxford, Vienna, Minnesota, Harvard, New York, Chicago, Budapest, Yale, and Duke. So these 16 got together and said, we've got to come up with a new idea. And in her book, she points out that they wanted to create what's called an EES, Extended Evolutionary Synthesis. They wanted to come up with a new idea to replace Neo-Darwinism. Shortly after this was published in the journal Nature. This is one of the most prominent scientific journals in the world. Does evolution need a rethink? And they have people arguing both sides. And in this article, this is what it says. The mere mention of the EES, Extended Evolutionary Synthesis, often evokes an emotional, even hostile reaction among evolutionary biologists. Too often, vital discussions descend into acrimony. Even among the atheists, there's angry arguments about doing away with Neo-Darwinism. Why? Perhaps haunted by the specter of intelligent design, they're afraid that creationists will use it against them. Evolutionary biologists wish to show a united front. They want to make you think that they're all in agreement. Well, shortly after this, Dr. Jerry Fedor, about the same time, it's actually 2007, Dr. Jerry Fedor from Rutgers, who's not a creationist, he was trying to say the same thing. Neo-Darwinism that's taught in school is not true. And he wrote this article called Why Pigs Don't Have Wings basically showing how evolution cannot come from random mutations and natural selection. 3 years after this, he wrote this book with Dr. Piatelli Palmerini, What Darwin Got Wrong. The whole book is devoted to showing that what is taught in public schools is wrong. And this is what they say in the book. We've been told that even if Darwin was substantially wrong to claim that natural selection is the mechanism of evolution, notice this, nonetheless, we shouldn't say so. Not anyhow in public. Why? Because millions of tax dollars in this country are going to support it being taught in school when they know that it's false. They go on to say the main thesis of this book is that natural selection is irredeemably flawed. And then he says, okay, if Darwin got it wrong, what do you guys think the mechanism of evolution is? Short answer, we don't know what the mechanism of evolution is. As far as we can make out, nobody knows exactly how phenotypes evolve. So did he become a believer and deny evolution? No. He still believes it. He just admits we don't know how it happened. I've written 2 articles on this, if anyone's interested, that cover this whole topic. The latest one on the right, Neo-Darwinism is dead, yet still taught in public schools. It was just published in Truth Magazine this month. So in this article, I list a number of quotes, and we're going to go back through time and show you that for decades, scientists have known that what is being taught in public schools is wrong. This is 12 years ago. Emeritus professors Dr. Depew and Weber from Cal State University, Fullerton, say Darwinism still rules the evolutionary roost. They really mean Neo-Darwinism. Darwinism in its current scientific incarnation has pretty much reached the end of its rope. It can no longer serve as a general framework for evolutionary theory. Then why is it still taught in public schools? Let's go back further. 15 years ago, Dr. Eugene Koonin from the National Institutes of Health, and I just have the shortened citation here. The complete citation is in my article. He said the edifice of the modern synthesis, Neo-Darwinism, has crumbled apparently beyond repair. So not to mince words, the modern synthesis is gone. Then why is it still taught in public schools? Let's go back further. 29 years. Dr. Brian Goodwin, a biologist from Open University, UK, and I'll point out none of these people are creationists. They all believe in evolution. He says Neo-Darwinism has failed as an evolutionary theory. What it does provide is a partial theory of adaptation or microevolution. Small-scale adaptive changes in organisms, which we've covered this week. Now we can go back even further. This again is Lynn Margulis, who we pointed out last night. She's one of the most prominent evolutionists of the 20th century. She won the 2008 Darwin Wallace Medal. It's only given to evolutionists every 50 years. So the next time it will be given out is 2058. She was given it along with Stephen Jay Gould in 2008. And although she's one of the most prominent evolutionists, she also says Neo-Darwinism is false. Notice what she said 33 years ago. I have seen no evidence whatsoever that these evolutionary changes can occur through the accumulation of gradual mutations. In Susan Mazur's book, The Altenberg 16, she said the source of purposeful inherited novelty in evolution, the underlying reason that new species appear is not random mutation. Then why is it still taught in schools? Also in this book, notice what Dr. Antonio Lima de Feria, professor at University of Lund, said. The experimental results have been available for the last 35 years, but have been ignored or silenced to avoid creating cracks in an edifice based on randomness and selection. They don't want people to know that Neo-Darwinism is dead. Let's go back even further, 1958. If anyone doubts this, tell them in 1966, 58 years ago, there was a whole conference on this. The title of the conference that was published was Mathematical Challenges to the Neo-Darwinian interpretation of evolution. This was at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the purpose of the conference was to show that mathematically you cannot create evolution by mutations. Now, one of the speakers at this conference was one of the best-known mathematicians in the history of the world, Dr. Stanislaw Ulam. He was part of the Manhattan Project, and he came up with the Teller-Ulam design, which is the basis for modern thermonuclear weapons. So he was like one of the top mathematicians in the world. So he analyzed this idea, can evolution happen from mutations? This is what he said. It seemed to require many thousands, perhaps millions of successive mutations to produce even the easiest complexity we see in life now. It appears naively, at least, that no matter how large the probability of a single mutation is, the chances of such a change seem to be practically non-existent. The conclusion of the conference is Neo-Darwinism is dead. That was 58 years ago. We can go back further. Let's go back 71 years ago. This is Dr. Cecil Martin. He was chair of anatomy at McGill University, and this is what he wrote 71 years ago. The truth is there is no clear evidence of the existence of such helpful mutations, despite what your teachers are telling you. In natural populations, endless millions of small and great genic differences exist, but there is no evidence that they arose by mutation. He's saying, yes, we believe in evolution, there's differences, but it didn't happen by mutation the way they're teaching you in school. Also in the same year, Dr. N.H. Nielsen, also at the University of Lund, had this to say: the proof of the occurrence of mutations is by no means a proof of current evolution. Mutations, and I can give you the full quote, we just don't have time to read it. Mutations are always constitutionally weaker than their parent form or species. In a population with free competition, they are eliminated. It is therefore absolutely impossible to build a current evolution on mutations or recombinations. Let me ask you, if we knew this 71 years ago, why is it still taught in schools today? Because they don't have anything to replace it with. Until they have something to replace it with, they're not going to give it up. That's dishonest. So, if Neo-Darwinism is dead, what theory of macroevolution will be taught in its place? Just in my studies and research, I've come up with 26 proposed alternatives to Neo-Darwinism. And we could spend a lecture on each of these 26. And I'll tell you, each of these 26 is even less likely and more ridiculous to believe than random mutations and natural selection. So what's the take-home point for this? Evolutionists today are at a stalemate. They're unable to agree on a new evolutionary mechanism, but they're unwilling to denounce the teaching of Neo-Darwinism in schools and universities. Why? Because they have nothing to replace it with. And they're unwilling to give up their philosophy of macroevolution. So if Neo-Darwinism has been dead for 70 years, why is it still taught in public schools? I'll go back to what we started with. I think the Bible gives us the answer. Number one, dishonesty. Men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil, number one. And number two, fear of the majority. The scripture says that those that believed in Jesus did not confess him lest they should be put out of the synagogue. And should we be surprised? Paul told us in Romans 1:18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Notice this, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. That's exactly what's happening. They are suppressing the truth. They do not want you, they do not want the general public to know that Neo-Darwinism that's taught in schools is dead. So 2 recommended responses when you're confronted with macroevolution by a teacher or a professor These are just a couple of things you could say. Number one, you can tell them the best scientists admit that Neo-Darwinism has been dead for decades, and then simply ask them, if Neo-Darwinism is dead, what do you propose is the replacement mechanism for evolution? So in summary of tonight's lesson, 3 points. Number one, there are no transitional fossils between major biological phyla, therefore macroevolution did not occur. Number two, fleshy tissue and DNA in dinosaur fossils disproves macroevolution. And number three, Neo-Darwinism, although scientifically dead for over 70 years, is still taught in public schools because evolutionists cannot agree on a new mechanism to replace it with. Let's put our faith in Jesus. Let's put our faith in the Scripture, which will stand when this world is gone. Thank you for your attention tonight. As every night, we will conclude with an invitation to invite anyone who would like to put on Jesus Christ in baptism, have your sins forgiven in baptism, Acts 2:38. Go down into the waters of baptism, Acts 8:36 through 39. To know that baptism does now save you, 1 Peter 3:21. And that's in fact how we get into the body of Christ. The Scripture says the only people that are saved are those in the body of Christ. Notice in 1 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, 1 Corinthians 12, it says, "For as the body is one and hath many members, and all members of that one body, being one, are one body, so also is Christ." We are all one in Christ. If you are not in the body, you are not saved. How do we get in the body? Notice 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 13. "For by one Spirit are we all baptized into one body, whether we be Jews or Gentiles, whether we be bond or free, and have been all made to drink into one Spirit." If you want to be baptized into Christ tonight, we would like to help you. We invite you to come forward as we stand and sing this hymn.